Good evening and welcome to Moral Politics. I'm your host, Bill Wolford. Demonization of Iran is underway. Maybe you've been convinced that Iran is an existential threat to Israel and the world. That propaganda traces to, you guessed, Israel. My guest, Richard Silverstein, has cried foul over the chicanery used by Israel to demonize Iran. The world threat may actually be Israel's hysteria over Iran. Richard Silverstein is the founder and blogger at Tikkun Olam and Al Jazeera. He recently hosted an Iran peace conference, and he is a repeat guest to Moral Politics. It is my pleasure to welcome returning guest, Richard Silverstein. Richard, does the rhetoric against Iran, especially in regards to its nuclear program, match with the real threat?
No, I don't think it does. I think that there's been a level of hysteria that has been raised by Israeli politicians, generals, the intelligence establishment against Iran that doesn't match the actual threat that Israel faces currently from Iran. There's no question, we should get this out of the way, there's no question that Iran is pursuing nuclear research. It's enriching uranium, and the processes that are underway scientifically within Iran could eventually at some point lead to them being able to produce a nuclear weapon. But producing one and producing a delivery system and all the different components that have to go into creating an actual nuclear weapon that can be delivered are very, very complicated technically. And everyone, almost everyone, even the Israelis, concede that Iran is not there yet.
Now, I mentioned earlier that you're a founder and you blog at Tikkun Olam, as well as now you are blogging for Al Jazeera. Tell us a little bit about that.
I've been blogging since 2003. I started just before the Iraq War began. And I am one of the earliest progressive Jewish bloggers who blogs about the Israeli-Arab conflict.
And you've covered Iran extensively, haven't
you? Oh,
you?
yes. For at least the last year or two, I've been covering all of the developments that have happened, the sanctions that the United States government has attempted to impose, the rhetoric that the Israeli government is using against Iran, Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, saying that Iran is like Munich in 1938. This is an existential threat to Israel, that Iran wants to destroy not just Israel, but all the Jewish people. And this kind of what I call nonsense and hysteria is really creating a distortion in Israeli politics that could actually lead to military action against Iran and a total disaster in the region.
Well, you put your beliefs into action. I noticed that in response to the local Jewish Federation and AIPAC Get Iran conference, you hosted recently a conference yourself.
I did.
You had some distinguished guests there, and it was focused on peace.
Right. I looked at the program that the Federation put together about Iran and felt that it was very skewed towards a hawkish view of Iran. It wasn't realistic, and I didn't think that it was factual. The speakers that were invited didn't really have any particular expertise in Iran itself. They knew what the Israeli position was towards Iran, and they presented that position, but they didn't present any balance. I wanted to do a program that would present a much broader, much more refined view. I wanted to bring actual professors in these disciplines. So we had Ian Lustig from the University of Pennsylvania, who's an expert on Israeli politics. We had Mohammed Sahimi from the University of Southern California, who's an expert on the Iranian nuclear program. And we had Keith Wiseman, who has worked for AIPAC in the past and was their Iran specialist. And so we had three people who really were well versed in all of the issues.
Did any of them feel that an Iran strike was imperative?
All of them felt that that would be counterproductive, and that that it would be actually a disaster for the region, because it would destabilize the region. It wouldn't achieve its intent, which would be to rid Iran of its nuclear capacity. Which would be incredibly difficult to do by a military strike. It would destabilize, as I said. It would possibly provoke terrorist attacks by Iran and Iran's proxies against Israel, possibly against the United States. It would just be an utter disaster.
Article that appeared on your Tikkun Olam blog about the nuclear triggers is
Right.
very revealing about the chicanery that is used to demonize Iran. You want to tell the viewers about that?
Yes, the Times of London produced a report that was supposedly based on authentic Iranian government documents, which supposedly verified that Iran was trying to develop a nuclear trigger device. This would be a technical part of the process of creating a nuclear weapon. It needs to be triggered, and this particular device is a very critical component of that. So the fact that if they could have actually found a government document that documented that they were doing this, it would have added tremendous proof, authentication to those who were claiming that Iran is on the road to creating a nuclear weapon that it wants to actually be able to deliver. The problem was that reporters Phil Giraldi, who's a former CIA agent, and Gareth Porter, who writes for an online news portal called Interpress Service, discovered from their source was an unnamed CIA official that the Times of London was relying on a fraudulent document, much like the uranium claims that Niger was providing yellow cake for Saddam that were used to bolster the claim of WMD in Iraq.
Do you agree that there is an ideological dimension in Israel that is causing this Iranophobia?
Any time that there is any nation or any group in the world that seems to have an agenda that would lead to hatred of Jews or wish to kill Jews, this creates this immediate, visceral, kind of primitive response in Israelis of trying to protect themselves, trying to make sure that they are not under threat. And if the average Israeli perceives this kind of threat, they would be willing to go to any length to protect themselves.
But does the average Israeli perceive the Jabotinsky Zionism that might be at root causative?
I don't think that they are that aware of their own history, their own Zionist.
In fact, we need to explain what Jabotinsky Zionism is and how at root it may be causing this angst.
I think that Jabotinsky does inform a lot of strategic thinking and tactics by the Israeli military and intelligence. You have this concept of the iron wall that Jabotinsky put forward, which is that Israel should surround itself with an iron wall, that it should be impregnable to its enemies, that for every attack that an enemy of Israel makes on Israel, that it should respond tenfold. A very harsh, hawkish, brutal kind of sense of the Middle East reality, in which Israel is always going to be potentially at war with its neighbors. It's never going to find peace unless it dominates the region. So the question you raised before about hegemony is an important one. I think that in the Jabotinsky mode, there has to be Israeli hegemony. Israel has to control the agenda. It has to control its enemies. It has to take away from its enemies the ability to hit or harm Israel, even though between you and I, we understand that that's impossible. That's a view that Jabotinsky may have had in the 1920s or 30s, but history has changed, the current
times
situation.
are different.
Times are different.
The impossibility of negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis, is it rooted in Jabotinsky Zionism?
I think that many Israelis believe that it's impossible to come to terms with Palestinians, probably the majority. That doesn't mean that Israelis aren't pragmatic enough to understand that they need to try to come to some kind of accommodation. It doesn't mean that there can't be a negotiation and a resolution of the conflict. But if you have an entire people who basically doesn't believe that it's possible, it really does foreclose a lot of things. And I think that the Jabotinsky kind of hostility towards the Arabs does inform that view.
And that's where you go back to the iron wall type of hunker down mentality.
Yes.
Yeah. Now,
Yes.
one of your guests at the Iran peace conference that you hosted, Ian Listick, dared to share some really insightful commentary on the Holocaust, that at root, to understand the Israeli, probably Jews in general, but especially Israelis and the conflict zone that they're in, you have to understand the Holocaust. Do you agree?
Oh yes, definitely. I think that Ian Lustig made a very good point. He compared the impact that the Holocaust has on the average Israeli to post-traumatic stress disorder, saying that this severely traumatic experience that Jews have had, and it's not just the Holocaust, but if you go back in Jewish history, you have the Crusades, you have the Spanish Inquisition, hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout history have been murdered for their religion, and the Holocaust is sort of the crowning achievement of the Jew haters throughout history. And so yes, I think Jews almost in every day are thinking in their minds about either about the Holocaust or about the fact that there are enemies of Israel that might like to impose a Holocaust on Israel.
Lustig went on to add that, Professor Lustig added that there's a cult of the Holocaust where Israelis and probably Jews, observant Jews, re-traumatize themselves. They relive and are reminded of the 6 million dead.
Yes.
And that very tellingly, he said that it is this angst over the Holocaust that may be a real danger.
Yes.
Even if Iran is not.
Yes, I think there's always a danger in a society. If you look at Serbia and Slobodan Milosevic and his sense of grievance and the loss of Kosovo, which informed the genocide that the Serbians perpetrated there, it's the same thing in Israel, that history has given Jews this terrible sense of wound and trauma, and it prevents them from actually seeing the reality right in front of their eyes. Because instead of seeing Palestinians with whom there might be peace, they see a Nazi. And it's a very strange kind of historical mechanism that happens. If you look at the rhetoric of the Israeli leaders like Bibi Netanyahu, he deliberately calls the Iranians Nazis. He deliberately invokes the year 1938, the Munich Agreement, which brought Hitler to sway in all of Europe. He wants Israelis to forget that these are Iranians. He wants them to only think about guys wearing swastikas on their arms. He wants them only to think about Ahmadinejad supposedly saying, "We will wipe Israel off the face of the map." And all it requires is it's like Pavlov's dog. It requires just a bell to ring, the Holocaust to be mentioned, and Israelis go into this shutdown mode and they stop thinking about what's right in front of their face.
But there's no recall that Hillary Clinton in the Pennsylvania primary went on record as saying that she would annihilate Iran. Of course, she was appealing to the Jewish voters of Pennsylvania, which is a heavily dominated Jewish state.
Yeah.
So it seems like perceptions are depending on which tribe you're part of.
Right. Well, I think that plays happens as well in the United States. I think to a much lesser extent because we don't have the same traumas. But I think that the Israel lobby here in the United States is trying to invoke that same kind of spirit. There's been a lot of distortion that has crept into the political dialogue about Iran. The whole sanctions movement here, which is attempting to ratchet up a new level of sanctions on Iran, and the claim that somehow these sanctions will bring Iran to heel and will make it give up its nuclear program or completely.
Have sanctions ever worked that way?
They only worked in South Africa, and that was a totally different historical situation. But when they've been tried in other situations, they haven't worked. All of the people, the experts at the Iran conference that I organized agreed, including Keith Wiseman, who, when he was at AIPAC, wrote the first set of legislative sanctions in 1995. Even Keith Wiseman admits that sanctions cannot work in this situation.
Well, they just hurt the average person and actually jade them from the,
Yes.
the parties that are causing the sanctions.
That's
making their
right.
life
They
miserable.
will just hurt the average Iranian. They will just hurt Iranian children, just like the sanctions we imposed on Iraq before the war hurt the poor, they hurt the children, and many, many hundreds of thousands of Iraqis ended up dying of malnutrition and other kinds of illnesses because of the sanctions. And the same thing will happen in Iran, and the people that will benefit in Iran will be the Revolutionary Guards who have control of the Iranian economy and have devised all sorts of methods to circumvent sanctions that have already been imposed. It's a placeholder policy because we are basically bankrupt. We don't have a policy that will really engage Iran and negotiate a real resolution of this problem.
Do you think that this whole issue of nuclear ambiguity is somehow causative, that Israel has been operating as a nuclear ambiguous state, and now Iran is imitating them and operating potentially as a nuclear ambiguous state?
I do, and that was another point that Mohammad Sahimi mentioned at the conference, that Iran is composed of some very, very astute people politically and scientifically, and they studied what Israel did in the 1960s at Dimona with their own nuclear program. And what, as you called it, the studied ambiguity, where Israel has almost never acknowledged that it actually has nuclear weapons, but the entire world knows that it has nuclear weapons. One time Ehud Olmert, either deliberately or by accident, conceded that Israel had nuclear weapons, and he was roundly chided by everyone in Israel for that. But everyone knows that Israel has somewhere between 60 and 200. I've even heard a number as high as 400 nuclear devices, but it never acknowledges it. It wants to let every neighbor, every potentially hostile neighbor, know that it will never say that it does, but if they ever think of attacking Israel in any way that causes serious damage, they want them to know that they will not be afraid to use their nuclear
There was an
weapons.
interesting point raised, I forget which guest at your Iran Peace Conference, about the usable and useful aspect of nuclear weapons. They may be useful, but they're not usable.
Right, right. They're useful in the sense that they allow Israel to impose a sort of hegemony over the political agenda in the Middle East. They don't allow any hostile neighbor to conceive of an attack against Israel that would really be an existential threat, because they know that if they were to try to overrun Israel or do something along those lines, that Israel would use nuclear weapons. Of course, the nuclear weapons are not usable in a place like the Middle East, because you will not only destroy your neighbor, but you'll destroy yourself.
So this whole argument about existential threat really is rather hollow then, if you are talking about a nuclear Israel and a non-nuclear neighbor.
But the irony of this situation is that Israel claims that the Ayatollahs in Iran are so insane, and they use those terms, that they're willing not just to destroy Israel, but to, in the process, destroy their own country. They kind of view the Iranians as, the concept of the mad mullah, that for the sake of their religion and their ideology, they're willing, like Samson, to pull the pillars of the temple down and destroy Israel and Iran. And that there's some sort of holy self-destructive impulse in Iran that roots itself in Islam. And that the whole Middle East, Iran would only be happy enough to bring the entire Middle East down if it could just achieve this religious goal of destroying Israel, which is in itself a kind of an insane notion. But Israel is very happy to kind of put that forward to the world and see how much of the world is willing to absorb it.
Do you think there's any possibility that Israel would strike on its own Iran?
I think that Israel would like to strike Iran if it could. I think that Obama probably has been holding them back. I know for a fact from the news media that Bush gave a red light to Olmert when he went to Washington, and I believe his chief of staff also went to Washington to try to get an agreement on that, and Bush wouldn't give it. And certainly if Bush wouldn't give it, Obama, I can't believe, would. Now the question is Israel crazy enough or desperate enough or whatever the word you want to use to do it on its own without the support or with the deliberate opposition of the United States. That I'm not sure about. I think that Israel definitely wants to wait to play out the sanctions issue and give time to that to see whether that quote-unquote works, which it won't. There may be a time in the next few months that will come up where they'll say to the world, sanctions haven't worked, now we want to see what the next step is, what the world is willing to do for us. And if you're not willing to take whatever the next step should be, then we're going to have to consider doing it ourselves. And that might be the point at which Israel might attack Iran. Now, would Israel be able to succeed if it attacked Iran?
Right.
That's another issue. Anthony Quartersman, who's a very prominent defense analyst in Washington, has written a long report about this issue, and he claims that there is very little likelihood that Israel could actually succeed on its own in achieving its goal in Iran, which would be to seriously set back the nuclear research, the nuclear program. It would require so much intricate coordination of military equipment, and it would require so much success in terms of targeting bombs. They'd have to get to the exact right place. They'd have to have so much intelligence to know exactly where to strike that it's almost impossible for him to conceive that Israel could succeed.
And Israel would certainly weaken itself by taking this action, certainly in the court of world opinion.
It would weaken itself in a lot of ways, because if you look at it from just a pragmatic point of view, one thing that Jabotinsky said in this Iron Wall is that Israel has to have the deterrence, it has to have the certainty among its enemies that it will succeed in destroying them if they attack Israel. Now, if Israel attacks Iran and it doesn't succeed, it doesn't create any long-term damage to the program, it's lost the deterrence. That's what happened in 2006 with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Military means cannot be used to impose its will on its neighbors, and that's what Jabotinsky believed was the only way for Israel to go, and that's what the current Israeli government believes as well.
Do you think that Jabotinsky's Zionism is coming home to roost, so to speak, that the elites of Israel are living in greater fear, not only from their enemies, but from their own government's actions, and that they're immigrating from Israel, and that it's leaving behind an even more radicalized average population?
I don't think that concept permeates maybe the top level, the senior leadership, but it certainly does impact younger, well-educated. And Ian Lustig has done a lot of research on the outflow of intellect, of intellectual property, of the brain drain from Israel that happens as a result of this ceaseless, this unending drone of war and conflict and hostility that happens, that many Israelis, especially younger Israelis, see that this could be what happens over the next decade, 2, 3, 4, and they see their entire lives living under this pall, and they don't want it, and that's why they consider leaving Israel. Now, if Israel does attack Iran, that ratchets that up even higher, and then more people, more younger people will be thinking about doing that. Unfortunately, it leaves the true believers in place in Israel. The Netanyahus, the Likud party, these right-wing nationalists who are so fervent in their beliefs and so certain of their beliefs that they're willing to take Israel down the road to war and potential destruction, not believing that that's what would happen, but that could be the ultimate outcome.
What about the idea that we should stop sending military support to Israel? After all, nukes, if you're an Iranian, can be seen as a lot cheaper alternative to planes and tanks.
An option that George Mitchell mentioned recently on the Charlie Rose show on PBS. And he said that if Israel continues to be intransigent about a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that the U.S. has some serious options at hand, that it provides $3 billion to Israel each year in the form of loan guarantees that are used to purchase weapons and various other things. That in the past, George Bush Sr. used that money that the U.S. provides Israel and cut it off in order to pressure Israel. And when that money was cut off, Israel, A, toppled the government, and B, entered into the Madrid negotiations. I believe that if the U.S. threatened to withhold, or did withhold if it needed to, that money, that would cause a huge impact in the internal Israeli political dynamic. And that is something that we need to not be afraid to use.
Now, it was stated at your conference, the Iran Peace Conference that you sponsored, that the politics is not separable from the weapons. Now, for viewers that are wanting to get involved and are concerned, what can they do? How can they make a difference?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, first of all, what they need to do is just educate themselves. I think they should start looking in whatever media outlets that they read online or the newspaper. They should try to find sources which educate them about what is going on in the Middle East.
Well, we can go on record and say that there is no existential threat to Israel from Iran.
No, I don't believe that that's the case at all. And I think that people owe it to themselves to try to find sources in the media that will educate them about that type of issue. Read people like Roger Cohen, the columnist in the New York Times, and others that are putting forward really sound, well-reasoned coverage of Iran and of the relationship between Israel and Iran. And also support NGOs in Israel and here that are trying to ratchet down the level of conflict, human rights NGOs like Human Rights Watch. In Israel, there's some wonderful organizations. There's one called B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization. There's Peace Now, which is an organization some of our viewers might have heard of. Those are very, very important groups in an Israeli context because they put forward a message that is not heard in the mainstream media as much and is not heard certainly in the political echelons, and that is that there is hope for peace through negotiation. And
is there any possibility of a nuclear-free Middle East?
Countries in the Middle East either have nuclear weapons or they want them.
Right.
And the more that this process goes on where Iran is engaging in this kind of research that could lead that way, other countries will then need to do it. So the more countries in the Middle East that have nuclear weapons, the more likelihood that eventually one will be used. So a nuclear-free Middle East seems the sanest and most rational way to go.
And it seems that the planners in Israel would want to embrace that now, early, rather than wait for multi-party nuclear states. Richard, I want to thank you very, very much for sharing.
Thanks for having me, Bill. I appreciate it.